increase of autism coincided with the introduction of this preservative into vaccines, and that many people began to see the effects shortly after their children were vaccinated. However, in our case, my son was showing symptoms right from the day of birth. In fact, he didn't cry for the first 3 days of his life, which is very unusual for a child. And we noticed that the delays were there right from the start in every way. And in our particular case, and by the way, my wife has given me permission to use this because it does bring some personal information into play. She happens to have Rh negative blood, and I have Rh positive blood, and all three of our children were born with Rh positive blood. We have a situation in our family we would call Rh conflict, and which can be deadly to children with Rh positive blood who are born to an Rh negative mother if she has been sensitized, which means if one child is born with Rh negative blood, some of the baby's blood gets into the mother's blood at the point when the placenta separates from the uterus, that the mother's immune system can then raise antibodies against this Rh factor if she has Rh negative blood. Fortunately, there is a very effective treatment for it, which is an injection of a substance called ROGAM, which prevents or helps prevent the antibodies from forming, so that the mother will not become sensitized. And with our first two children, my wife received those injections after the birth of the children, but by the time she was pregnant with Michael, our autistic son, the protocol had changed. There was concern that there might be some tearing of the placenta during pregnancy that could sensitize the mother, and so the standard protocol then was to give the ROGAM injections during the third trimester of pregnancy, which she received. And ROGAM has relatively high amounts of thimerosal in it, or at least had at the time. And so when I read about this as a scientist, I thought this fully explains our situation with autism. It seems to coincide with the increase in the frequency of autism. I was convinced that thimerosal was the culprit. Well, out of concerns that it might be the culprit, the drug companies voluntarily withdrew it, and the FDA recommended withdrawing thimerosal, and in 2001, childhood vaccines no longer had thimerosal in them. And so this gives us now, I remember hearing that and thinking, now here we have even though it is not necessarily a scientifically controlled experiment, we now have an epidemiological situation where in the future, with thimerosal no longer in vaccines, we should see a decline in the frequency of autism. The reverse has happened. There is, the frequency of autism has continued to rise even though this preservative is no longer there. Moreover, quite a number of studies have, fairly large, well-controlled studies have been done on the effect of vaccines on autism. And what all of the reliable studies have shown is that there is no association with vaccination and autism when comparing fairly large groups of children who were not vaccinated with those who were. The frequency of autism appears to be the same and is rising in both groups. And thus there's no valid scientific evidence to indicate that vaccines are the cause of autism. Unfortunately, the publicity on this has resulted in fairly large proportions of children who now are no longer vaccinated because their parents, out of fear that they might have autism, insist that they not receive the vaccines. And it is now to the point where in certain areas we are seeing outbreaks of childhood diseases that had essentially been not eradicated, but kept largely in check because a large enough proportion of children had been vaccinated to keep those diseases from spreading. And so there are now outbreaks of measles, mumps, and a number of other. Whooping cough is another one, a very devastating illness for children. that is increasing because of the number of children who are not vaccinated out of fears that parents have. And so this is not something that just affects families who have a child with autism, but also affects all of us because of the risk that these diseases that vaccination has kept under control are now on the risk of those is now increasing as a consequence of parents choosing not to vaccinate their children. And also I think underscores what those of us who are educators love to say over and over and over, and that is that education, science education, does make a difference. It is important for all of us, whether or not we are going to be scientists, to have a good understanding of what science is and what it can do, so that we can make rational decisions when it comes to things such as our public health, and base the decisions that we make on reliable science rather than on the fears that some people have. Nonetheless, I am very well aware, having gone through this personally, the emotions that families can have, and the emotion to look for any possible cause. What could it possibly be? And to look for any possible treatment. And so even being a scientist, it's difficult to separate that powerful emotion and that powerful love that we have for our children from and be able to look at the science in a dispassionate and reasonable way. Let me take just a little bit of a break from science. This is Science for Breakfast, and so much of what we'll talk about here is science. But I'd like to share with you some of my own personal experiences and talk just a little bit about my son and who he is as I begin to model his face here, so that you come to have an understanding of out of one individual what we see as families and as the individuals themselves who have autism, and what their lives are like, and what they bring to all of us. As I mentioned, my son is now 18, going on 19. He tends to be happy most of the time, and he tends to fall on the very severe end of the autism spectrum. On all of the various behavioral tests and educational tests that are used to classify autism, he consistently places in the lowest 1%. And so we're facing in our family a situation of a child who is quite severely disabled. His developmental level is probably about the equivalent of a 2-year-old. So imagine a 2-year-old in an 18-year-old body, and what that can be like. But nonetheless, he is generally a very happy child. In fact, the caregivers who work with him, I get word back that they always, everyone wants to be with Michael because he can be so fun to be around. In large part because he does act a lot like a 2-year-old, and 2-year-olds, of course, are so fascinating as they're just beginning to discover the world and learning how to speak. And that pretty much describes my son at age 18. He is one of the characteristics that is fairly consistent with autism is some sort of speech delay. And indeed, he began speaking at about age 10. That was when he used his first word. And his first word was, uh-oh. And he knew what it meant, too. And so he was using it appropriately. And when he did that, I thought, oh, here we go. Now we're going to have the flood of language that came. Well, I've learned since to never count on anything. Because he now has a vocabulary of probably about 30 words that only our family and his caregivers and teachers can understand. Just as an example, he has some real difficulties using consonants, certain consonants, and so he can't use the consonant k like C or K, and so he substitutes T for it, and so his word for car is da, and then also because when he hears a word that has a lot of syllables in it, he oftentimes has trouble getting all of the syllables out, and so he will invent his own word to describe it. One of his favorite things on earth is a helicopter, and his word for helicopter is a-o-u. And when he was learning colors, many of the colors that he learned were similar to the sounds. For instance, blue was boo, and red was ne, and green was ni, but for some reason orange was not ni ni. And one day an orange helicopter went by and he ran outside, not ni ni ah ooh, not ni ni ah ooh. And fortunately we were able to understand it, but it's very difficult, of course, for others to understand the language that he uses when he refers to different things. One of the most innovative and I think odd words that he has is he's always been fascinated with rototillers. And his word for rototiller, and I'm not sure how he came up with this one, is just simply ugh. And but to give you some idea of how innovative he can be in using his language, I was out after a fairly heavy snowstorm. I was out working with the using a snowblower to clear the driveway, and as I came back in, he said, "No, snow tiller." And he recognized the similarities between a rototiller and the snowblower. And so there's this fascination, of course, that we all have with children as they begin to learn language. And we've had that wonderful fascination with our child now for nearly 19 years. And so it's in many ways, it gives us the chance to have the perpetual joy of having of seeing the childhood wonder that comes from what he's able to experience. Moreover, he will he has certain behaviors that are, it's typical of autistic children to have certain repetitive behaviors, and he certainly has his share of them. And one of them is that every day he seems to have the opportunity to run his hands through something like water, or one of the things we have him do is he'll carry a bowl of wheat around and he'll reach down into the wheat, grab it, and then he holds his fingers up and watches it drop down, or he'll do the same thing with water or with sand or other things, and he does that for several hours per day. And so finally one day I thought, what's the fascination with this? And I tried it, and it really is fascinating to watch try it sometime. Go out in the sand pile and grab a handful of sand or some water, hold it up to your eyes, and watch as the perspective changes when those things drop down. It really is a fascinating thing to watch. And of course, I would never have had that insight without having an autistic child do that. One of the things I would love to do is to be able to spend some time within his brain and really understand how he sees the world. Having raised him as a parent, I think I certainly have some of that insight. I can begin to see the ways that he perceives the world that tend to differ from others. And I try in many cases to try to see the world the way he does, and in so doing, be able to better connect with him and see that his wants and needs are met better as I do that. And as I begin to see the world through his eyes, or I think better through his brain, it helps me, I think, understand what human nature is like, and how all of us in many ways are different in the way that we perceive things, and the wonderful diversity that we do have in this world. All right, let's go back now for a moment to